Okay, so we're going to get started today with exercise 210, which, like we've been doing, we're flipping back and forth between Rhino and V-Ray, and now we're back into the V-Ray world today. And the purpose of lecture today is to really explain how materials work. And we've done a few materials exercises, enough for you guys to know how to adjust some of the basic settings. But we're going to take it a step further and really analyze what makes a good high-quality material and how does that material work and or apply in our files. So today, there's a sample Rhino file for us, the materials test.3dm file. It's under exercise 210. So if you go to exercises and you go to spring 2018 and you click on 210, you will get this materials test 3dm file. I already have it on my flash drive, so I'm going to go ahead and open that up here, if I can find it. Yeah, you can just open it. I should have had it open ahead for you guys, but oh well. All right. And once it's open, you'll see that essentially what it is it's a cube with a sphere on top, an infinite plane, and a light. So there's not much to this particular scene, but I set that up in advance for you so that you wouldn't have to spend a lot of time creating this object. It's really today about materials, not about modeling in V-Ray. And so what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with applying a material and then kind of analyzing what's happening in that material. And I use this as my example. This is not something that you have to follow along with. It's more a dialogue where we talk about what this material is. So I'm going to go ahead as my first example, and I'm going to load the cedar shingle siding. Let me preview it and see if it lost it. Let me reload it off of my flash drive as an example here. Okay, and so this is the material that I have. It looks like, you know, standard shingles on the outside of a building. I'm going to apply that to my material test layer. So let me go to material test. Right-click and say apply material to layer, and I will put it on my materials test layer. There it is. And then I'll go ahead and I will render this out, and we'll get the end result there. I probably should apply to this surface too, so that it's all I'll just apply it to the selection there. And let me go ahead and render it. And we get the end result, which is the shingle siding. You guys have done this before. You've loaded up materials before. This shouldn't be a big surprise. But what we want to spend time doing today is actually analyzing what makes this material look like the actual material. So if I look at this right now, see how the edges have little jumps to it that are like shingles? They have the little texture to it. That's all built into V-Ray. It's not part of my original object. If I were to look in here, for example, that's just a nice straight cube. But as I look at the rendering here, you see that it has those little bumps on it. Furthermore, if we zoomed in and did a closer up rendering, we'd see little bits of wood texture, ins and outs of wood texture. All of that's built into the V-Ray material, not the geometry in Rhino. So let's take a look at what makes up this material. So I have open in Photoshop an example here that starts to talk through what's happening with these materials. So first off, the first piece of it, we'll call that 1, up here at the top, is a photograph of the shingles to begin with. So in this particular example, somebody wanted to create a shingle siding texture. So they went out and they photographed a shingle siding, a piece of shingle siding, and then they created what's called a tiling texture of this shingle siding, which basically means if I copied and pasted this together end to end to end, it would look like one seamless piece. We wouldn't be able to discern where the seams would be. So it's called a tiling texture. If you were looking for this kind of a texture online, if you searched for shingle siding tiling texture, somebody probably has done that for you. And depending on what the licensing was, you might be able to find something like this. So that's the first part. That's just a photograph. There's no ups and downs. There's nothing special about it. So that's part one. Part two here is something called the bump map. And so if I were looking at this closely, you could see that there's kind of, there's some ups and downs. There's like the wood grain. Let me zoom in a little bit and see if you can see it a little bit in there. Maybe right in here. You see those little kind of wood grain patterns? So that's something that's called the bump. So sorry for my crude lettering here, but that's called the bump map. Then we move down to the next part. And if you see here, we could see along the side there's that little slope that kicks up, and there's also some grooves in between the shingles there and there. This is bigger in dimension than the wood texture. This is large jumps. And so that item number 3 here is called the displacement. So I'll call this disp. That's the displacement map. And then finally, here at part 4, we have all of it put together. So we get the wood grain texture, we get the jumps on the sides, and it actually looks like shingles. So you can see how we go from just the photo, and I should say this is just a photo. Okay, photo, we apply the bump, which is the wood grain. We then apply the displacement, which gives us the ups and downs. And finally, we get the texture where we see everything at once. So those are key components that make up this shingle siding texture. So let's flip back over into Rhino and or V-Ray. Let's look at that material again. So here's my shingle siding texture that I've gone ahead and I've loaded. And if we look at, there's the example. Here under the diffuse drawer, we've applied the material or the photograph here under color. So and I'm going to walk you through how to create something from scratch too. But I'm analyzing what's here right now. So if I preview this, there's my photo. That is just my, like the photograph that somebody took of the shingle siding. It's right here is the file, and it's inside of my folder. There it is, the shingles diffuse, D-I-F-F for diffuse. There they are. So I'll go ahead and say, OK, that's the photograph. If I were to turn off everything else and render it, I would get, and actually let me go ahead and do that for illustration purposes here, something that looks like shingles, but if you look at the edge here, it's just a flat edge, no jumps, and there's no real wood grain. It's just the photograph that I'm seeing. Let me zoom out a little bit. There you go. So you can see it. It looks not bad, but it's not quite as good as it can be. So then we come in here to my materials again. And under the map section, so we just looked at the diffuse. It has the photograph on it. Under the map section, there's 2 values. There's a bump map and a displacement map. Those correspond to these 2 pieces, the bump and the displacement. So let's have a look at those 2 pieces of the puzzle. So under bump map, if I check the box to turn it on, and I click on the M, the bump map here is essentially, I can preview it, there you go, but I can also go show you what it is. Right there, it's called shingles_bump, and it depends on who created the material as to how well organized and how well named these pieces are. But in this example, it's well named, shingles bump. It's essentially a high contrast black and white version of the color image. Black and white being different and providing the ups and downs, the subtle texture of this particular image. So if I were to turn that on, which it now is, let me say OK, and I were to render it, we're getting a little bit more of the wood grains, a little bit more of the ins and outs of the wood grain. So it's subtle, but it's a little bit. And you can kind of see it down in here is probably the best place for you to see it. And I know it's always hard on the projector, but you'll see it when you guys work with this today. So the last piece of that puzzle, oh, and I should mention, this value here is not necessarily related to any units in your scene. It's just how strong is the ups and downs, how strong is that bump map. Start at 1. If it's too strong, decrease it, maybe to 0.5. If it's not strong enough, you could increase it all the way up to maybe 10. If you start increasing this up to 100 or 200, chances are you really need the next piece, which is a displacement map. So this should really be between 0 and 10, not much higher than that. Displacement map here, these are large jumps in the texture. So if I think about what shingle siding looks like, let me create a new layer here that I can work on. If I looked at it in side profile, right, the shingles essentially go up and then come down and go up and then come down and go up and then come down, something like that. And I know my drawings are really crude, but you guys get the idea, right? So what bump map does is it tells V-Ray, oh, there's this surface needs to slope up to here, then jump down back to where 0 is. So we could call this line right there 0. And we could call this upper line here 1. It's essentially going from 0 up to 1 and then back to 0, and then up to 1 and then back to 0. This is represented by a black to white gradient. And sometimes I get which side is black and which side is white mixed up in my head. So it's one way or the other. And it doesn't matter because you can check a box to inverse it if you do it backwards. Anyway, so this then would be black. This end over here would be white. And we'd be creating a gradient that's going up from black to white. And then it starts at black again. So let's have a look here at my displacement map. I'm going to click on the M. And I'm going to look here at the displacement. There it is. So I did say it was backwards. So this edge here, actually it might not be. I have to look in the final version. We're going from white. And let me go ahead and open that a little bit bigger so that you guys can see it better. Sorry, wrong folder. Sorry, I just wanted to make this a little bit bigger so you guys could see it. Of course not. Don't save. Let me open it in Photoshop. There it is. Control 0. Okay, so because these shingles overlap, the shingle actually goes from black to white in between these other shingles. That's how it's set up. But essentially, this is a slope from one height to 0. And so that piece applies back here in V-Ray. You can preview it there. Did I have this inverted or not? Yeah. So I did do it backwards. So the white edge is the part that sticks up. The black is at 0. So like I said, if you end up messing it up, there's a option for, of course now I can't find it. Invert, right there. So if you did it backwards, you can just check the box for invert. It's not a big deal. Okay, so now when I put those three pieces together, there's one last thing, and that is that I have to set the value of displacement. So where on bump, I said it was kind of an arbitrary value between 0 and 10. This value here in displacement is actually in the default units of your workspace. So 0 would be where we start, flat with the surface. How much it sticks up is this value in inches. So I'm working in inches, so I want it to stick up by 1/2 inch. I'll put in 0.5. If I wanted to stick up by 2 inches, I'd put in 2. So it's tied to the units, which is why if you load one of these materials and you're not in inches as your default units, you're in feet, for example, you'll suddenly have shingle siding that'll go out 0.5 feet, which would be 6 inches, and it won't look right. So we want to make sure our units are set in inches. So there I am. And now if I were to go ahead and render this, if you look right here along the edge, you'll see that my shingles will stick up by 1/2 inch and then slope back. So there they are right along that edge. So I've added that little bit of texture to it. And the advantage here is that my Rhino model is still just a flat surface. It's nothing too complicated. I'm doing my texture work just in V-Ray. Pretty cool. So that's kind of the basics of bump, or diffuse, which is our photograph, bump map, which is our texture, and then displacement map, which is how far up it sticks. So let's look at another example. So that was my first example. Right here was my first example. Let's look at this example. So you guys have seen corrugated steel before in buildings? If I took a photograph of the corrugated steel, it would look something like this version up here on the top. That one. Remember, this is the photo. I can draw. There you go. Second version right here is that bump map. So this was our bump. Now, in this case, there's not a whole lot of bump to steel. It's pretty smooth, right? So I probably could even leave that part off of the material because it's not adding much to my material. I could do a high contrast black and white version, but it's just not going to help me too much. The third option here is the displacement. So I'll put a D over here for displacement. And that's going to give me the corrugations, the ups and downs, or the waves. So what would this look like from black to white? It would be like a white to black, back to white, back to black, back and forth. So we're going to look at all of these in pieces. And then finally, this is my end result, where I've got the photograph applied on the corrugated steel, and that then makes up my final version. So let's look at it in Rhino. I'll go into my materials here. I'm going to load up my corrugated steel. I'm guessing that it lost its link, so I have to go back and there it is. And let's look at the various pieces. So first off, under diffuse here, if I clicked on my map, we'd see there's my diffuse just photograph of the steel right there. And I'll say open. OK. If we come down here to the bottom, we've got bump map and we've got displacement map. Like I said, the bump map isn't doing much. In all honesty, we should probably turn this off to conserve rendering resources. It's not going to help much to have it on. But when I made the material, I left it on. It's only set at 0.1, so it's not changing very much. And that is a high contrast black and white version of the image. Displacement map, however, this is how we're controlling how much that corrugation sticks up. So I have the displacement set at 1, so it's 1 inch of displacement. And the map looks like we would expect it to, with basically black and white stripes. If I were looking at that a little bit closer in Photoshop, let me see here. There it is. So we just have that black to white transition. And we're going to use that to create the waves in our corrugation. So that's then set right here as our displacement map. I could preview it and have a look. And then I could apply all of that to my shapes here. So let me go ahead and apply material to layer. Oh, sorry, I did it to selection. There we go. And I could go ahead and I could render that out. And you can tell that this is a little bit more complicated than the shingle in terms of the ups and downs. There's a lot more for V-Ray to calculate. So it's a little bit slower in the process. OK, so there it is with our little corrugations. Looks like I'm having a few material issues along the side there that aren't giving me the best results. Probably a texture mapping problem with how it's compressing the image. But if we look here, I want to point something else out. See how the shadow is cast by this sphere across the pieces, and that the shadow actually jumps and corresponds to the texture map or the displacement map? So V-Ray is actually calculating it as if the surface was waving. And so it's really important to realize that V-Ray actually looks at this as a whole surface. So it looks like there's a few issues with this particular one, but you get the idea of how it works. Now, if I wanted to change, for example, and have those ribs not be so high, I could adjust that value to, say, 0.5. I could also adjust it to 10, and my ribs would go 10 inches. And I get a really spiky, weird-looking thing. So the point is that that's where the adjustment happens. OK, so that was kind of going through those two examples, very much similar in terms of how we're looking at them. So there's my steel siding example. Now I'm going to throw something else at you, which is that we have our standard image, like usual. So that was our photo. I'll put a P there. Our next piece here, this is the same thing. This was our bump map. Gives a little bit of texture. This one, the third one, instead of the displacement map, we're doing a transparency map. It's allowing parts of the image to become transparent, which then ultimately, when we put it together, becomes a mesh. So we can see through this particular piece of object. So just like with the other black and white of the displacement, this time black and white are going to represent solid and transparent. So if I were to look at the options for this mesh, which is this yellow plastic-coated mesh, let me re-import it because the links are lost here. This would be under metal, screens. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and apply this to my selection. There it is. And so here we are. My diffuse map is this, which is essentially the picture of the screen of the yellow mesh with a black background behind it. So it's not transparent. It's just the color on the black. And then I get to my bump map. Let me say OK. Here's my maps. I have a bump map that gives me a little bit of texture, which is that high contrast black and white. Probably, depending on how far away you're rendering, you might not have to worry about it. It might be enough not to have that turned off. I didn't turn on a displacement map because I don't have a lot of thickness to my file. I can have it basically flat. It's a wire mesh. The other option, though, is opposite the diffuse. This is the photo, is transparency. And you guys have adjusted the transparency prior to now by just adjusting the color value of this transparency. So black being solid, white being transparent. If I look in here, I've used a transparency map this time. So there's my transparency map, just black and white. And if we preview it, I did it backwards again in that original file, so it's checked for invert. And so there it is. That represents what's cut out. I can say OK. Now when I go to render it, we'll be able to see right through. Oh, it doesn't matter. This as if it were a mesh. So we've controlled what parts of this surface are transparent. So we didn't have to cut any holes in the surface. So, frequently I see people, when they're starting to model, trying to cut holes through their surfaces. You don't have to. Just make a surface and then apply this on it. It's a much easier strategy. So there it is. We're seeing it as a mesh, and we're seeing through it. I'm not going to let it finish. Notice, though, that the rendering times went way up, because now it's calculating the rendering of this surface, and then as we look through, we're doing the backside of this. The only issue with this strategy is that if you had some displacement to it, let's say you had the so that the wire had a half circle on top, the underneath side is going to be the inverse of that. So when you're looking through it, it's not going to show the other half of the circle. OK, so I've worked through that option. Let me go back to Photoshop. And I have one more example with the transparency map. In this case, it's metal. So I start with my first piece. There it is. There's my photo. Second piece would be my transparency map. And then I get my final option down here, which is all of it put together. Same strategy, same things apply. So now that I've talked through what these various pieces mean, transparency map, bump map, displacement map, now it's time to actually start creating your own material. So I wanted to give you the overview of what this is, and now we're going to create our own material. And so why do I make you do this when I give you a big material library? Because inevitably, you'll be working in your design, and you'll decide you want a particular material, and it doesn't exist. And why should you, as a designer, have to compromise the material you want just because it wasn't part of the package of materials that I gave you? So I want to talk you through how to create it. Now, I've broken this into two sections as part of your exercise. So those of you that took 135, you can do a little bit more involved work. Those of you that didn't take 135, you obviously don't have the Photoshop skills to do this. That's OK. You don't have to. But I like to break it in so that, and I will show you both examples. I will start, however, with the non-digital tools people, the people who didn't take 135. I'll talk through the materials first there. And then we'll move into the 135 option. Now, if you're actually doing this, let's say you did take 135, it doesn't mean you have to do the 135 section, right? You can do the other option. However, if you did take 135, I encourage you to at least try to do this with one material because you'll learn a lot in the process. Okay? So many of the materials that I gave you in your material package, I actually did this, and I created them from scratch. So it happens, and sometimes you have to do it. OK, so let's start working with these materials. So what I've asked you to do in Part 2A, if you've never done this before, is go to one of the V-Ray materials websites that are out there. There's a couple of them out there. You can do a Google search for V-Ray materials, and you can find them. In my example, I suggest using the vraymaterials.co.uk. I think it's a pretty good website, and they have some pretty good materials out there for you. There's other options that require you to actually register for the site. There's one here where you'd actually have to register. I thought I was registered, but apparently I'm not. In order to download the materials. So if you're going to do the vray-materials.de, you'd be looking to actually have to register and whatever. Anyway, so this RenderBox Studio, vraymaterials.co.uk, is what I'm going to use. And I'm going to show you a couple examples from there. So here, for example, they have dark brick V-Ray material 3ds Max. So the problem here is that the material stuff exists that we need, but this particular material was made for 3D Studio Max, not for Rhino. So if I were to click on this, we can get to the main page here. And I'd say, OK, I want to download that file. So let me see where it is. Remember, there's always lots of ads everywhere. So you have to figure out which ones are not the ads. I think this is the non-ad version. Yep, there it is. And so it's downloading this file for me. It was that button. This one. Download now. Yeah, there's so many different start download. It's all ads. So, OK, so I went ahead and I clicked on that button to download it. There's the V-Ray dark bricks. So let's take a look at this zip file. So I'm going to go ahead and extract it. I'll just extract it right here. OK, so let's look at what they created for us. This first file, this is the file that you would be loading into 3D Studio Max if you were loading the material. It would be the equivalent of Rhino's .vismat or Rhino V-Rays.vismat file. And we have a couple other things. The vismat file is the file that Rhino's V-Ray plugin uses to load materials. And so for 3D Studio, it's a different file format. And I don't remember what the format is of this file. But I can probably tell you. I don't know, it's not telling me what it is. Anyway. But as we look at it, it gave us a photograph and it gave us a bump map. So it didn't give us a displacement map, which is too bad, because I think that would be good for this particular material. But we can still use these two pieces to create a material from scratch. So let me go ahead and jump back over into Rhino. I'm going to go into my V-Ray materials, and I'm going to right-click on Scene Materials and say Create Material Standard. So we're building a brand new material. You guys have done this before, but you haven't loaded all the pieces before. So I'll start here by renaming my material. This was dark bricks. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Now I have dark bricks. I need to load in the diffuse material. So I'll click on the lowercase m. This is the photograph. And when I click on that lowercase m, I need to go find the bitmap. It's called a text bitmap of what I just downloaded. So that was in my downloads file, dark bricks, and it was this DSC 2688. So like I said, depending on who created these files, the naming structure can be obvious or maybe not.
And no computers bitmap usually refer to a different file format.
Right. When it says the text bitmap, it's referring to any image file as opposed to a bitmap. It's not the real bitmap file. So I'm going to go ahead and use that as my image file. There it is. And I'll say open. I can preview it. Yep, looks like the dark bricks. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And that then gives me a set of bricks. But it didn't give me the bump map. And they created the bump for me. So I'm going to go into my maps, down here at the bottom, maybe. There it is. I'm going to turn on the bump map. I'm going to click the little lowercase m. I'm again going to choose text bitmap. And this time I'll choose the bricks bump option. And I'll go ahead and say OK. I'll say OK here. And if I were to preview it, we should see a subtle difference in what you guys, I'm sure, didn't see that on the projector, in what this looks like. I might have to adjust the value here. Maybe I'll bump it up to 10 and see if we could see anything. No, you're probably not going to see it. Once I've put this together, I'll right-click and say Apply Material to Selection. So I get it on the whole object. And I'm going to jump back into my further away view, and I'll do a render of this whole thing. So I'll click on the render button, and we'll take a look at what their dark bricks look like. So again, I think this would be better if it had a displacement map to it. I think it would be a better quality material, but it ended up OK. And so what I'm asking you to do in this part 2a is to go find some of these materials, I'd say at least 4, and see how you can put them together. So I was successfully able to put this particular one together, and it's now rendering in V-Ray, which is good. Once I have it put together, it also looks like, in this particular case, they didn't tile the textures correctly because I'm getting some really strong seams. So it's a little disappointing. I'll pick another one and try it. When you're done with it, make sure that you pack the material. So I'll right-click on dark bricks, and I'll say Pack Material. You should also save the sample render file, this file. So you're going to save that sample render file, and you're going to pack the material. Let me try it with another example here. Let's go back to the website. Let's go to V-Ray Materials. Now, there are other materials that can be a little bit more. Let's try this one, the fence material, and see. So this one we'd be expecting a transparency map, not a displacement map. So let's try that one. I'll download this one. Let me show it in its folder. Let me extract the files. And there it is. So it looks like we have a metal texture. That's probably the diffuse file. And we also have the cutout for what the chain link looks like. So we've got those two pieces. This would be the transparency map. This would be the texture map. So let's go ahead and build that one in V-Ray. So I'll right-click on Scene Materials and say Create Material, standard. And this would probably be chain link. Make sure you do name the materials. If they're all default 1, 2, 3, 4, it doesn't help you figure out what they are. So name the material, descriptive name for the material. And so I'll start first with loading in the metal. And they use the texture for us. So I'll click on the M, and I'll go into text bitmap. And this time it was fence. There it is. There's my metal texture. I'll go ahead and open that. And if I were to preview it, there it is. It's shown up. I'll say OK. And now if I previewed it, it would look like the metal texture. OK, that's good. Next piece of this one is the transparency map. So remember, that's not under maps. It's under the diffuse color transparency. I'm going to click this little M, and I'll go to text bitmap, and I'm going to load that chain link. And I'll go ahead and say OK. One more OK. There it is. If I click on preview, we should get a sense of what it looks like, which it did a terrible job of previewing for me. All right. We're going to go ahead and apply it to my materials and take a look. Sometimes you have to do that. So let me apply to selection, and let me go ahead and render. I think the chain link is backwards. So it turns out that it is backwards. So I need to fix that problem. So let me go back in to my V-Ray material. And under my transparency map, you should notice that when I first clicked on it, it was a lowercase m, and it's turned into a capital M. Once you have a map applied in one of these, it'll turn from a lowercase m to a capital M. So you can always tell where that's been applied. So let me click on that capital M now. And I'm going to need to invert it. So I'll go under texture manipulation here. I will check the invert button. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And now when I go back and render it, it will look the correct way this time. So my particular scene is a little bright for the projector. It's hard for you guys to see. But notice the shadow is also being cast as if it were transparent. So we're getting the shadows accurate to this as well. There's probably a little bit more texture mapping that needs to be applied. This chain link is a little bit large for the size of this object. So I would go in and adjust the texture mapping to compensate for that. In this particular example, my chain link doesn't have any metallic reflection to it. So in this context, it's just as if it were a flat piece of plastic or something. Frequently, metal has some reflection to it, so there may be the need to add some reflection. You guys did reflection in the past, so we could add it to this. I would do that by right-clicking on chain link and saying create layer. This would be a reflection layer. It's up here at the top under reflection. Somehow my V-Ray is really slow at clicking things. There it is. And so remember, I can also choose to control how much the index of refraction would be right here. I could drop that value down if I didn't want it to be so shiny. I could also change the reflection glossiness here down a bit, maybe 0.75, so that I get a little bit. There we go. Now we're seeing it. A little bit of shine, but not too much shine. So those were settings that we did previously. They still apply here as you're starting to create this new material. So when I'm done with the chain link, I would once again right-click and go to Pack Material. And that would then collect all of the stuff that I need for the material. So let me go through and show you this part of it. If I were to pack the material, let me go into today's demonstration here. It's called Chain Link. I'm going to go ahead and pack it. When I do that, it goes and collects all the pieces that I need for my material to work. So it should be chain link Why didn't it? There it is, chain link. It's in a zip file, so I would need to extract it to see it. There it is. It went and created the vismat file, which is the file I need to be able to reload in Rhino. But it also gave me the opacity and the metal texture. So even though those two pieces were in my downloads folder, when I pack the material, it goes and gets those and puts them in the zip file. So you always have all the pieces that you need to make the material work. OK, so in part 2a, I'm asking you to go find these materials and test them out. Load them in, make sure that they work. So if you've never taken 135, that's about the extent of what you can do. If you have taken 135 and or you have some experience in Photoshop, you can create a material completely from scratch. Yeah? OK. You can create a material completely from scratch. You could do it as far as go out and take a photo of a wall and go from that photo all the way to creating a material. I went and looked on Creative Commons for some sample images. Actually, I looked through a bunch of sample images, trying to find something that was a good set of textures that I would create into a final version. And so what I'll do is I'll start in Photoshop, and I'm going to open the first one. So I'll go to File and then Open, and I'm going to start with, and get over into the correct class here. I'm going to do a hardy siding because it's a really simple siding to try to do. I'll go ahead and say Open. There it is. Rather simple siding. So the first piece of this is I need to make this be able to repeat itself over and over. So tile in all directions. So I have to start by creating that tiling texture, which, by the way, if you want or you need practice creating it, if you go to the Digital Tools site and you go to Tutorials and you go to Photoshop, about 3/4 of the way down here, we have Displacement Map, Bump Map, Transparency Map, and Tiling Texture. All of those are relevant to you guys. So I'm going to do the tiling texture right now. And so I'll start by thinking about how I'm going to crop this image together. And if I think about trying to tile it right now, for example, if I were to tile it, I'd have a short little bit here connecting to a short little bit. So I'd have a stripe of a not full piece of siding. So I'll start by cropping my image, and I'll use the crop tool here. And I'm going to crop it so that I'm about halfway down on this first piece. And I'll crop it so that I'm about halfway up on this piece. The idea being that this edge will then seam to that edge long term. So I'll go ahead and confirm it. The other thing that I have to be careful of is how straight are these lines going across. They look pretty straight, but let me drag a guide down and take a look. Well, that one's not bad. That one's not bad. That one's pretty good. And that one's not too bad. So I think I'll be able to make this one work. The next piece of information I need is what's the size of my image. So let me go to Image and then Image Size. And it looks like my image size is 1920 by 1100. I just need ballpark numbers. So about 1,000 and about 500, 600, something like that, 550. I'm going to go up to my filter. I'm going to go to Offset. Oh, excuse me, Other, and then Offset. And this is where I'm creating the seam. So these are half the numbers that I just looked at. So this was about 1,000. And this was about 500. And you can see that it's creating a seam right along there. And it also created a seam halfway through. It's right about here. But you really can't see it. That one's already pretty well seamed together. If I drag these sliders, you might be able to see it a little bit more depending on where I cut the joint. I always like to try to put it at about the halfway point. It was 550. There it is. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And what that did is it rearranged my image. All right. It rearranged my image and cut it up so that it took 4 quadrants and put them back together. The idea is that this side here matches up perfectly with that side there. This bottom matches up perfectly with the top. So all I have to do is repair the middle of this and make it look like it tiles. So what I'll do to do that, and it actually looks like I have a little bit of an angle on the photograph. So I probably should have fixed that first, but at least I'll show you this process. I'm going to go into the clone stamp tool, which is right there. I'm going to come over my drawing, and I need to adjust. I don't need the grass brush this time. I need just a standard diffuse brush. I need it nice and soft because it's going to blend in a little bit easier for me. Yeah, maybe a little bit more. And my size, that's a little bit big. We'll drop this down, maybe about like that. Maybe a little smaller. Yeah, like that. And what I'll do is I'll hold down Alt to copy from. I'm going to copy from right there. And I'm going to move over that seam to try to make that seam go away. Same thing here. I'll copy from here. Sometimes you have to kind of work your way up a little bit. And or over a little bit. And eventually you can tie those two together. I still have some discrepancies in the where these joints happen. So I'll go back to Alt, and we'll try to copy over a little bit to make those seams go away. Maybe we'll copy that a little bit so that that goes away. And you can see that I'm starting to make these feel like they belong together, about like that. And you can see that that section is now healed, where I'm not seeing it. This takes a little bit of time and a little bit of clarity. The more complicated these drawings are, the harder they are to kind of get them to go together. And that's not too bad. We need to do a little bit more down here, like that, like that, like that, something like that. This piece is now relatively seamless. If I press Control 0, we can see that that piece has been fixed. These other pieces still need to be fixed. So I don't want you to have to sit and watch me fix all the pieces. I'm just trying to show you that you would do it. Then I'll save this piece as my diffuse. So I'll go to File and then Save As. And let me create a new folder for this. Oops, apparently I can't type. Okay. And well, we can leave it as that name. I could also say this is _diff for diffuse. And I'll click Save. So now I have that piece as a JPEG. Next piece is that high contrast black and white for the bump map. And I would do that going up to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to do a levels adjustment. And I'll say OK. And like I said, I want this to be high contrast black and white. So I'm going to pinch these in so I get a nice deep dark black. And I'm going to pinch this in so I get a nice bright white. It's not supposed to look perfect. It's not supposed to look good. It's supposed to have high black and high white value and a little bit of gray in between. Sometimes you want to adjust that middle value so you get that right in the middle. That looks pretty good. I will go to File, Save As. And this one isn't going to be the diffuse. This is going to be the bump. And it's going to be a JPEG. And I'll go ahead and click Save. So now the next part of this, and I can turn that off, is I need to think about this as to how these slope. So this front edge sticks out more than the back edge. So I'm going to be creating gradients as I do this. So I'll create a box first, a selection. And we'll do this one, for example. And I'll come over to my gradient tool between black and white. I'll set black as my front edge. Let me create a new layer for this. I'll start right there. I'll hold down Shift, and I'll go to where I meet that part. And it did a great job of making it black and white, didn't it? So let's try that again with black and white, not orange and yellow. There we go, black to white. That gives me that gradient. I'll repeat this, or I could just copy it and paste it, save myself a little bit of time. because this is siding, they're all even. So it saves me a little bit of time. So now I have all those pieces together. Once again, I'll go to File and then Save As. And this one would be the displacement. So DISP for displacement. I'll go ahead and say OK. Oops, that was not supposed to be a Photoshop file. That was supposed to be a JPEG. Save As. JPEG. Save. So now I have those pieces. It's time to go back into my Rhino file and create the material for this. So I'll right-click on C Materials and say Create Material Standard. We'll rename this to be Hardy Siding. I'll go ahead and say OK. I'll start with my diffuse. Maybe. There it is. First off is my color. I'll go to my materials, and I'll go in to text bitmap, and I will pick what I just saved. So let me go into today's folder. There it is. That would be my diffuse first. And I'll say OK. There it is. Then I would go in. I don't have any transparency, so I'm not going to worry about that. I'll go down to my maps. I'm going to turn on bump map. And I'll go find my bitmap. And I'll turn on my bump map, which remember is that high contrast black and white version. And we'll start at a value of 1. We'll go ahead and preview it. Yeah, we get a little bit of the texture there. Then I'll get to my displacement. Once again, I'll click on the M. Choose text bitmap. This time my displacement is those gradients.
So you always use the bitmap. So what does other do?
We'll get to those later in the semester. But for right now, we just stick with these. And I'll go ahead and say open. And I'll say OK. Remember, this value is how much does it stick out. So if it's left at 1, it's going to stick out an inch, which is a lot. So maybe 0.5. Actually, Hardy's probably a little thinner than that, but we'll make it look better by saying that. If I say preview, we should see a little bit more of it show up here. But I can also right-click and say Apply Material to Selection. Now it's been applied there. And I can test it. I'll do a render. And now it created that Hardy siding. Anybody notice the problem? It's upside down. So I did the black and white backwards. So I need to fix that. So I'll go back to my materials, and I will go to my displacement, and we're going to check the box for invert. I'll say OK, and then we'll go ahead and render it. And now it's going in the correct direction. So essentially what I was able to do is I was able to create a material entirely from scratch. And obviously, I would spend a little bit more time fine-tuning this material. I went through it rather quickly because I wanted to show you the process of doing it. So the same strategy applies for a variety of different things. If I went back in, I had a couple other examples that I could do that I found earlier. There was a stone wall. There was some paving stones, something like this. Let's see if we can. Of course, it doesn't want to show the whole thing. Some paving stones, for example. Again, it's just about making sure that they tile together seamlessly. So you'd have to do some clone stamping, but something like this would be reasonably easy. A lot of people do brick. Brick is an easy one to try to do. But you could do a Google search. Many of the tools or many of the materials that you already have were created in the same manner. You find the original image and then work to create a good tiling texture. The more time you spend in Photoshop healing up those errors, the better your end material is going to look. So for those of you that did take 135, I encourage you to try this with at least one material and see how it turns out. Because you'll learn a lot from the process. Remember, this is about getting you ready in case you have some material that you need to completely fabricate from scratch. But you also should be very familiar with the various material parts by the time we're done. Okay, so we did everything. At the end today, I want you to upload your zip package. So remember, you pack the material. You're going to upload that package to the course website. You're also going to use your featured image as that rendering. So if I were doing this, I would save this as my featured image, and I would also go into Rhino and I would pack this material. So I'd go into the Hardy siding, I'd right click and I'd say pack material and get that zip file. When you go to post it, one more little side note. On the right side, there's a section for V-Ray materials here. Try to categorize your material, and that'll help other people find it should they want to use it. You guys should be aware by now that on the course website there's a bunch of materials. If you go to Resources, V-Ray Materials Library, there's a variety of different materials that have been used or people have posted. If I go to wood, for example, you can see various pieces of wood or wood texture that people have done. Generally speaking, if it has the Digital Tools logo on it, I did it, or at least worked over it and checked some of the options. But there's lots and lots of different materials that are available that you can go ahead and download. Hopefully they'll be categorized, and hopefully you'll add yours to the collection. If you go in and say all, I think it's V-Ray Materials Index, you can kind of see previews of lots of different materials that people have done along the way. Okay? So those are there for your use. By all means, you're welcome to use them. But today is learning the process of how do you put these pieces together. Don't forget about reflections if your material should have reflections on it. A good example of that is there's an asphalt material in the material library. One is regular asphalt, the other is wet asphalt. The only difference is there's a reflection applied to the wet asphalt. It makes it look like it's wet. But it's essentially the same material. So you can think about those as a creative way to enhance your materials as well. If there's not any global questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop, and then I'll come around and help you guys on an individual basis.